Hello.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
nice to be
Yasmeen,
here.
it's good to see you. And Yasmeen, you've been such a support. You've been there all throughout. I mean, absolutely, your commitment is really,
No, thank you. This is a pleasure because this is what I was saying to the young ones that, one never gets the time to attend. I really tried my best, but I missed quite a few nice ones. Professor Ackerman has been saying the last session was really nice.
It was excellent.
I'll try and find the YouTube.
Yeah, but with all our commitments, you've still stayed on for so long, Yasmeen. I mean, it was a very long and tiring day yesterday, and today also probably
thank you
will
for
be.
having me. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure, our pleasure, our pleasure. And of course, Professor Brandon Lebel, I mean, it's fantastic to have you too. I mean, we're very, very lucky that we got you. Thanks to Zeno. Yeah.
No, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah.
So welcome all once again to the plenary session of the conference Globalization and New Terrains of Consciousness. I will now introduce the chair for the session, Professor Zeno Ackerman. Professor Zeno Ackerman is a professor of British Cultural Studies at the University of Würzburg. His research focuses on correlations between poetics and ideology, on the reverberation of war, on the position of the novel vis-a-vis audiovisual mass media, on the concept of articulation and the problem of the voice, and on the afterlives of Shakespeare's works, inside as well as outside the theatre. Over to you, Professor Zeno Ackerman.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Yeah, welcome to this session of an ongoing long and, as I feel, very productive conference. We had a session before the break that very much focused on explorations of the city, particularly but not exclusively of Delhi, that focused on how the city is constructed and lived as a social and political space. Now, our present session will continue this debate in many ways. It will continue this debate, particularly by pondering the problem of relationalities, the problem of togetherness. So how is the social built? How is it disrupted and reconstructed? How are human beings positioned or repositioned in the social field? Indeed, the lecture topics in our present session suggest a fruitful juxtaposition of perspectives on the social. If Yasmeen Arif, our second speaker, will attend to the geometrical dimension of the social, our first speaker, Brandon Lebel, sets out to emphasize the formative and transformative role of the acoustic, of sound. So let me introduce Brandon Lebel first, and I'll introduce Yasmeen later on when it's her turn to speak. Brandon Lebel describes himself in his abstract, as it were, his bio note, as, quote, and I quite like this, an artist, writer, and theorist working with sound culture, voice, and questions of agency. Brandon's life story and life practice, I would like to say, seem to be informed by the kind of open creative positionality that once used to be described as cosmopolitan. Holding a Master of Fine Arts from the California Institute of the Arts and a PhD in Cultural Studies from the London Consortium, Brandon Lebel worked as a fellow or guest professor in many places. Let me mention some of those places, in surprisingly many places. The University of Copenhagen, Cornell, the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, Berlin's Free University, which is sort of a conjunction in life stories of the two of us, and Tel Aviv University. He is now Professor of New Media at the University of Bergen in Norway, of course. Apart from his work as an editor, Brandon Lebel is the author of a row of acclaimed monographs in the field of sound studies. By way of example, I will only mention 4 titles. The first one I would like to mention is Background Noise, subtitled Perspectives on Sound Art, a book that originally appeared in 2006, but I think has been republished since. A second book or title I would like to mention is Acoustic Territories, subtitle Sound Culture and Everyday Life. And I think that might be one of the links to this conference, this idea of the territory and the terrain and all of that. A third book, enticingly titled Lexicon of the Mouth. This is a study of the poetics and politics of voice and of what Brandon LaBelle calls the oral imaginary. That one was published in 2014. And the last one I would like to mention is titled Sonic Agency, Sound and Emergent Forms of Resistance. Apart from, or rather along with, these plentiful academic commitments, our speaker has been constantly active as an artist. The emphasis of his artistic projects is on working internationally, working collaboratively, and working in or within public space. Brandon also works as an editor of a Berlin-based publication initiative, as it seems to me, which is called, nicely, Errant Bodies. And I looked at the website of this initiative, and in the statement of mission of Errant Bodies, I found this initiative describing itself as, I'd like to quote this, describing publishing as, I'd like to quote this, an ecology of attention that underpins the making of community, an ecology of attention that underpins the making of community. I feel that this quotation might work rather nicely as an introduction of Brandon and of his talk, which is called On Acoustic Justice. So over to you, Brandon. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for your really kind and warm introduction. I'm also, very happy to be here and to join everyone and to contribute to the conversation. So thank you for having me. So today I want to consider this question of the phenomenology of globalization by focusing on acoustics and a subsequent politics of listening. Across a range of contexts and situations, listening is often positioned as what enables forms of relationality, recognition, and inclusion. Listening as key to human agency in terms of being heard within a public sphere. This can be appreciated by considering scenes of social struggle, for example, and social movement action, where underrepresented or disenfranchised communities not only work at capturing a collective voice, but equally demand to be listened to. While voice and speech are central to a politics of recognition, listening is equally important. Yet we might ask then, how does listening take place? That is, how does it find place? How does it work at negotiating the situational and attentional dynamics defining place? I want to reflect then upon these questions by focusing on the topic of acoustics. I emphasize acoustics as what positions sound, and by extension, one's listening subjectivity, and therefore acoustics as what must be addressed within a framework of recognition. By working through acoustics as a material practice, as well as a political question, I want to then lead us to an idea of acoustic justice. If acoustics contributes to positioning sound and one's listening subjectivity, does it not then participate in questions and formations of power, and as such, influencing the work of orientation and reorientation, what Sarah Ahmed emphasizes as a politics of positionality? Before moving forward, though, it seems important to reflect upon myself as a body, as a subject. To speak of positions and positioning, orientation and reorientation does suggest that I need to recognize the position from which I speak, at least to point at this as a question. While I cannot really engage this fully, it seems necessary at least to highlight my situatedness, especially if we are aiming to reflect upon globalization, having, in a way, the privilege of speaking now should be reflected upon. In speaking, I become aware also of how my voice participates or reinforces a given acoustic arena, an acoustic schema, influencing how we listen to each other and how necessarily we participate in certain habits of listening. So I want to focus on acoustics and how this lends to an acoustic justice model, how in speaking, for instance, I contend with and modulate the borders of a given acoustic arena or norm, to attempt to introduce other meanings, how my voice or another's can work at giving acoustic support to others to follow by specifically figuring or refiguring economies and ecologies of attention. The issue of acoustics then opens up an important approach to sound and listening in general by highlighting how one hears, highlighting how what one hears is always conditioned by a given environment. As the product of a series of frictions or resonances, sound is constituted materially by the different forces or bodies that come into contact at a given moment. My voice, for instance, arising from the resonant frictions of breath, meeting the vocal folds, meeting the oral cavity, and further to encounter a given architecture, a given channel of communication, and in passing along and through is acoustically shaped and defined. To highlight sound then as a carrier of a set of material frictions and encounters, which brings all that information, all that relationality further into the experience of hearing. I highlight this fundamental quality, this phenomenology of sound, in order to capture the ways in which hearing hears place, how acoustics as a materiality is at work in conditioning what one hears and how one hears, how we orient not only according to the content of what we hear, this voice, this music, but also by the ways in which sound situates us within a given acoustic arena. Acoustics is, in this sense, an architecture, a set of normative conditions, and an economy and ecology of attention. From such a perspective, a number of questions may be posed. What kinds of material, spatial, or social arrangements are made to facilitate the movements of a given sound, to lend traction to the articulation and reverberation of certain voices and meanings? In what sense does acoustics function to host a set of shared desires or to hinder their circulation, orienting persons around particular efforts or identities? This can be considered on a number of acoustic levels. For example, rhythm can be captured as what articulates forms of synchronization and syncopation, the timings and spacings around which bodily and social orientation is figured. Rhythm as a set of lines or tracks, paths and directions one falls in line with or breaks away from. As such, rhythm is a question of ordering, of repetitions and even rituals, and the laying down of particular temporal and spatial orders. Additionally, orientation is worked at by way of reflection and echo, where the movement of sounds through an architecture or environment contributes to cultivating responsiveness, how one responds and returns, reflecting back within a scene of conversation or debate. Yet, reflection and echo extend beyond the exchange of words, affording more embodied affective enactments. How often one echoes back through an array of gestures or manners of style, which greatly contribute to both agreements and disagreements, consonances and dissonances, participation and resistance. Rhythm and echo are just two examples or modalities for capturing acoustics as what influences orientation and what can be drawn upon in working against certain injustices or scenes of struggle. From the social acoustic to the electroacoustic, acoustics is profoundly at work when it comes to a politics of recognition and participation, the making and unmaking of communities and worlds. The force of acoustics can be appreciated by also considering how sound is at times weaponized, for instance, within prison architectures. There is a greater history here, which I can only point to, from early approaches to imprisonment based on silent systems and the isolation of prisoners, for instance, developed in the United States as part of a moral ordering of criminal behavior. Silence was understood as the basis for redemptive isolation or soul searching. And further to contemporary detention centers within states of war or conflict in which acoustics is deployed, for instance, in Syria at the Sednaya prison. As has been documented by the research group Forensic Architecture, prisoners at Sednaya are kept in the dark, forced together in small cells, and required to be silent at all times. By way of a silent imperative, prisoners are made to fear the smallest of sounds, as well as their own. Breaking the silence can lead to terrible beatings or even death. Sounds do occur, and often they are intentionally deployed in order to traumatize prisoners. From the sounds of torture reverberating through the corridors and cells, to the amplification of recordings of songs in support of the regime. The space of the prison is put to work on an acoustic level. As the artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan has shown, acoustics at Sednaya is utilized to create an environment of fear. So listening and the project of acoustics is a question of orientation. From the reverberations that orient one around shared desires to that of weaponized sound, acoustics is deeply impactful onto positionalities and the forms of agency one may capture or not. So considering the aspects of rhythm and echo then helps us extend acoustics from a question of materiality to that of practice. Acoustics as those practices or acts that work with or against a given social, spatial, or political configuration. While it's important to consider the articulation of particular sounds and voices, what such sounds communicate or convey, it is equally important to consider the acoustic practices or enactments that work to give traction, to host, to facilitate their movement and propagation. From sonic practices to acoustic practices, my aim is to consider how sound sounds, how voice voices, or how sounding is not only to deliver certain meanings, but to work at creating forms of orientation, to work at the greater situations and systems that are always influencing what some can do together. In her book, Queer Phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed elaborates phenomenology in order to capture how orientation performs differently across different bodies and settings. By way of queer phenomenology, orientation is emphasized as never freely found or captured equally to all persons. Rather, orientation is shaped by particular racial or heteronormative systems, for example, where one may be forced onto certain paths or positions. For Ahmed, it becomes essential then to put orientation into question, so as to enable one to grasp less straight forms of life. Ahmed's work of reorientation, as she terms it, is helpful in approaching acoustics as a question of orientation and the acoustic practices by which other orientations may be sought. Here, I may turn to one example as found in the social uprisings in Beirut starting in October 2019. At the start of the uprisings, which were founded on greater grievances of social and economic inequality, there appeared a constant reference to feeling unheard on the part of ordinary people. Dubbed an open mic revolution by the journalist Habib Bata, the protests and subsequent assemblies organized in the city were consistently based on upsetting a given order of hearing or auditory regime as dominated by the political elite. As one protester stated, quote, "From early morning talk shows until the evening news, our physical landscape is completely colonized by the political elite, their loyal pundits, and the talk show hosts that welcome them with open arms onto their programs, often laughing and smiling. This has been the case for decades, not years. So much so that any average Lebanese can recognize the politicians' voices if the news is on in another room. But over the last week, that situation has changed drastically." The intervention then onto the physical landscape was equally interruptive of the acoustic soundscape, focusing a shift in the social and acoustic order of what it means to speak and be heard. As such, capturing media channels and turning the city into an open mic can be appreciated as an attempt to reconfigure the acoustic conditions and norms that define not only what we hear, but equally how ordinary lives may meaningfully resonate to impact systems of governance. As an acoustic revolution, the scene in Beirut may be heard to capture what Gillian Siddall and Ellen Waterman term a negotiated moment. That is, the improvised adjustments and enactments that contend with or aim to remake one's situatedness within particular realities. Improvisation understood as finding a way out of a tight situation. This entails a capacity for responsiveness, close listening, adaptability, and co-creation, where one expresses as well as loosens one's identity along with others. Improvisation is an extremely dynamic gesture and capacity, which contributes to how one grasps what is around, responding to the temporal flow of events, the punctuated rhythms and voices, affording a range of negotiated moments, and the crafting of collaborative structures. The demonstrations and subsequent assemblies in Beirut speaks to a negotiated moment, gestures that seek to realign oneself by way of communal effort. So as I've been presenting and arguing, acoustics brings focus to the material, social, structural, and even technical conditions that surround and that impact embodied and collective life, as well as the affective and political dynamics influencing one's situatedness. In this regard, focusing on acoustics enables a range of inquiries, which have at their center a concern for the ways in which one may navigate and negotiate systems that impact on defining place and participation. In mapping these issues, I want to conclude then by posing the concept of acoustic justice. While expressions of sonic agency find articulation by way of the punctuated sounds one may make, acoustic justice considers the arrangements and configurations that allow for different types of orientation, from social and political to bodily and communal. As I'm posing, acoustic justice is a framework for understanding how one navigates the conditions of particular places and institutional systems, and how one may construct a path of reorientation, which is related to struggles over belonging and participation, of negotiating the social or institutional figuring of oneself and others. From the spaces of law, such as the courtroom, where the normative operations of the fair trial are grounded in the hearing of arguments and evidence, along with the right to reply, to scenes of the archive, where it's important to listen beyond the textual in order to consider what is missing or held back. Hearing and being heard are foundational to the work of justice. Acoustic justice is then positioned on a micro-political and macro-political level to consider the immediate ways in which questions of access, fairness, and ethical regard play out within street-level encounters, and further how acoustics participates on the level of law and government by contributing to the rules of audibility and the norms by which bodies are made to acoustically matter. In this sense, I may ask, if the right to be heard is essential to being recognized or to capturing forms of participation, how do we create the particular sites or scenes for such hearing to take place? And in taking place, to give way to forms of human thriving. Orientation, listening, and local negotiated moments can be thought further then into questions of globalization, to consider how an acoustic justice model impacts or is positioned as a global or planetary question. While I've been focusing on hearing and being heard as social and political, acoustics is also radically more than human and other than human. As the field of acoustic ecology convincingly shows, sounds greatly impact onto the life systems of environments. It further underscores listening as a path for not only engaging human sociality, but for attending to other life, displacing an overarching human-centric view and rationality. In such a context, listening is often posed as a capacity that fosters greater relationality as well as concern across life worlds, not to mention that of matter and technology, to recognize how technologies are greatly wedded to listening habits, putting so much sound into our ears. Following acoustics then into globalized and planetary perspectives, we can move from local practices of negotiated moments to a bioacoustic or even geoacoustic approach, to recognize listening as the making of an ecology of attention that enables a global perspective. As the composer Pauline Oliveros argues, listening is a capacity for recognizing multiple realities at the same time, from the near to the far, the internal to the external, the human to the more than human, the seen to the unseen. Oliveros captures listening as adept at connecting local and global realities and imaginaries. Such an understanding is given further traction in what anthropologist Rolando Vazquez terms de-colonial listening. For Vazquez, listening can wield a power specifically aimed against the modern colonial order, which is built upon a dominant voice of the Western universal subject. Under the modern colonial order, silencing is enacted onto colonized communities, as well as ecologies of planetary nature. De-colonial listening, therefore, is a gesture aimed at the outside of modernity, giving way to relationalities that attend to the voices of others, including planetary rhythms and reverberations. The performativity of such listening gives support to crafting a form of acoustic welfare, and through which understandings of justice are played out in terms of addressing audibilities and inaudibilities and their place within the work of reorientation. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think I'm taking over immediately. Thanks a lot for a wonderful presentation. That was really thought-provoking. I think the floor is open for questions, and I can see that a couple of questions have already, or at least one question has already been posed in the chat box. Shall I read it out, or Anna Frida Kuhn posed the question? Would you like to pose it again immediately, making us listen to your voice, actually?
Okay.
So we will read out the question for Brandon.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a question from Anna Frida Kuhn, who says the first question is, seeing as listening cannot be uncoupled from positionality, how do you, as an artist and writer, archive sonic encounters? Which archive does justice to acoustic encounters? What acoustic archives should and could, for instance, supplement writing as an archival mechanism? So would you like to answer this first and go to the second question?
Maybe you take both and then we can.
All right. So the second question is, to what extent have you been influenced by Dylan Robinson's hungry listening? Are there points of disagreement between the two of you as it relates to the act of positioned listening?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you also for your voice in helping us. Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, this question of the acoustic archive, I guess that is certainly a kind of interesting topic to reflect upon. I can say in my own work, in my own research, I haven't actually relied so much on acoustic archives or on sound archives or in looking into, you know, audio recording documentations and so forth. I can refer you to an interesting researcher, Ella Feiner, based in London. She's been very active in the National Library archives, particularly the audio archives, which have a long history stemming from, you know, sort of different anthropological recordings, as you can imagine, developed in the UK. And Ellen she's been an artist in residence there, I believe, a researcher, really looking into the very question that you're asking in terms of how, in what way does sound archives perform, etc. And she has a publication coming out this year, I believe, around this research. So it's not a direct answer, but it's something that I think may help you in your questioning. And then I guess with Dylan Robinson, yes, I've been really recently taken with his book Hungry Listening, you know, which I think really makes a wonderful contribution to these questions of sound studies, these reflections on listening from an indigenous perspective. And I think in doing so, he really, you know, asks us to reflect upon many of our, in terms of a certain kind of Western European cultural understanding of listening, as often being something that's very inclusive, even as I talk about it, the sense, the power of listening to be able to include others. And that can be very true. And I think what Dylan reminds us is that it can also be important to somehow blockade so as not to be heard, to kind of create a territorial, you might say, boundary of a kind of safe space. So listening cannot perform a certain kind of takeover or a certain kind of colonization of a community at risk, for instance, or a community in struggle. So I find this perspective and reflection really important, and it is something I'm learning from. Yes. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think we have one question coming directly from the audience, and I would like to switch to that. And this is Shugato Badori, who has raised his hand. So may I play it to you?
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. I actually would have found it very difficult to type my question, and therefore I thought that I could actually ask it, and which is just to a paper or a presentation on auditory justice. I have actually three questions, and the first two are related. So when we talk about protest sites, when we talk about agitations and the sounds produced therein, there is also the possibility of, within that general polyphony of sounds, the existence, the coexistence of sounds of the oppressors, and not just through the official media, as you pointed out. That is another thing where we get bombarded with sonic images and sound bites from the official media, but even in terms of the infiltrators, and we have seen it continuously, the saboteurs, as it were, who enter, and there are counter slogans raised, there are counter sounds raised with the objective clearly of sabotaging the actual auditory agitation going on. So to what extent must an auditory study of auditory justice, an acoustic study of auditory justice, take into account or parse out, or the noise, as it were, in a way filter or adopt some discretion about taking out the counter sounds, as it were? The second question, which is connected to the first question and leading to the same polyphony, in sites of agitation, and one has seen and been part of many in Delhi, there are also, let's say, incidental ambient noises, often of vendors, let's say, selling quotidian stuff because food needs to be sold, other things needs to be distributed. So there is a lot of ambient sound also, not necessarily in the contrapuntal agitator sound and the counter agitator sound economy, but also adding on to the polyphony are also ambient sounds and auxiliary sounds. To what extent must that also be taken into account while studying the general sonic economy of protest? So these were the first two questions, which are related. The third is, of course, an incidental question. If we focus too much on auditory justice, then do we somehow leave out of the scope of such a justice the ones who cannot speak, so to say? And one is not only talking about the deaf and mute, let's say, because they may have their own protest to lodge, or even non-human animals. Since you brought up the non-human question, since speech really demarcates the human from the non-human, so to talk about animal rights, non-human animal rights, that is, would a focus on auditory justice somehow leave that out of the scope? But more importantly, apart from these two, there are so many silent protests also, where deliberately the protesters, who are not necessarily not able to speak, but as a strategy, they deploy the act of silence. Must silence be necessarily seen as something that is not agential enough? That is my third question. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you so much for your response and all your thinking. Yes, I mean, the question of silence, I think it's very interesting, and as you point out, can be very powerful as a gesture, as a tool within sites of protest or demonstration or struggle. And I can just point out, for instance, this very inspiring collective and movement called Women in Black, which some of you might be familiar with, that came out of the Belgrade following the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And Women in Black continue today as an organization aimed against primarily a kind of anti-war protest group. And they specifically enact silent protests and really talk about silence as something that can really, as you suggest, like interrupt a given acoustic dynamic, interrupt what the kind of like the usual tonalities of political demonstrations, which you rightly suggest are usually very noisy. So silence, I think, can be very much a sound as well. It is a very strong sound. And maybe one comment about ambient noises, about this general cacophony that I think really you capture so nicely in terms of being such a complex and complicated arena of sounds. There's a wonderful researcher in Istanbul, Siri Özkun. She wrote her PhD about cacophony in Istanbul. both in terms of political demonstrations as well as national celebrations. And so those two meeting each other in the acoustic arena, these two very different kind of groups and communities that are generally oppositional, occupying the same acoustic space, and what happens in that kind of very confusing, noisy environment. How do you align yourself with particular voices or messages or communities? So it is, I think you really suggest nicely that there needs to be a lot of kind of detailed analysis and consideration when we start talking about acoustic justice and these sorts of things. And just, this feeling of this being overwhelmed by sound within those kind of conflictual scenes, and this idea of the possibility of the saboteur, which I think is so true, the ways in which kind of movements and counter movements and appropriations and reappropriations on an acoustic and sonic level are in a way so flexible, so open to capture, that I think it's on one hand that really lends a certain power and interesting complexity to sound, and at the same time it's very vulnerable, very fragile, very open to identifications and over identifications. So just to say, thank you for all your comments.
Yes, indeed. This has not only been evidently, audibly, a very thoughtful talk, but also a very thought-provoking one. And we have lots of questions in the chat book, and I regret to say that we won't be able to attend to them right now, because I feel we need to go on to the next speaker, to Yasmeen Arif. But maybe Professor Lebel, you would like to look at the chat box and maybe find ways, if you want to and if you have the time, to address some of these issues in writing, perhaps. The articulation of justice, of course, and I want to say that briefly. Somehow you have, as I feel, potently raised also the question, not only how sound can be a medium for achieving justice, but how sound potentially could also be a sphere in which the question of the nature of justice somehow can be pondered, needs to be pondered. And that is a totally fascinating question, I feel, but I just wanted to say that. And I want to move on to Yasmeen Arif, our second speaker, and it is really a great honor to introduce her. Prior to her current position as Professor of Sociology at Shiv Nadar University, which is close to Delhi, as all of you know, but probably our international audience doesn't know, Yasmeen Arif has taught and researched at an array of institutions in various world regions. So this is really something that both of our speakers in this session share, this global itinerary, autobiographical or biographical itinerary. So these institutions at which Yasmeen Arif has taught and researched include, for example, the University of Minnesota, the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, the American University of Beirut, and this is another strong link between the two of you. You used Beirut as an example, and Beirut has been a very, very important place and reference point in the work of Yasmeen Arif. She has also taught and researched at Delhi's CSDS, the important Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and at the Delhi School of Economics. I might say briefly that the problem or provocation of life is at the center of Yasmeen Arif's work. It is the idea of life or of making live that informs her constant endeavor of re-accentuating the notion of biopolitics. In her 2016 study, Life Emergence, subtitled The Social in the Afterlives of Violence, Yasmeen Arif determinedly combines global and local perspectives in order to assess the reconstruction of life-giving emotional relationalities in the aftermath of shattering events of mass violence. The study takes the scholar and her readers not only to Gujarat and Delhi, but also to Sierra Leone and Beirut, as I have already mentioned. Yasmeen Arif's work as an editor similarly focuses on huge programmatic concerns. After the publication of a rich collection of key essays in Indian sociology, a forthcoming edited volume is titled, and the title I think deserves spelling out, Event and Everyday, Empiricisms and Epistemologies. Yasmeen Arif's current research and writing concentrates on what she herself terms the biopolitical critique of identity politics. Her lecture for us today focuses on the pandemic present. It is called Body, full stop, Space, full stop, Social, full stop, Geometries and Geopolitics of the pandemic. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ackerman. And it's such a pleasure to be amongst so many thought-provoking lectures and the kind of discussions we've had over the 2 days, the little bit that I could be in have been absolutely wonderful. So I really would love to, be engaged with much more. I've learned so much through the little bits that I've been at. Today, I did try to think how I could respond to the concept note, which was very, very, in many ways, very intense for me. So I'm trying to do something new, so I'd certainly love your feedback on that. It does carry forth some of the points that Professor Ackerman has said so nicely. It is really, I couldn't have summarized perhaps my own work as well, but let me try and get right into it. I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Do let me know if you can see it. I'm not very sure how to do this, but I shall do it nonetheless. Okay, let's see how it's going to be. Do let me know if it's working out okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, great. Okay, so there I am then, straight into it. I have to try and put out a caveat right in the beginning that this is a small discussion of perhaps a larger idea, but I'm trying to share with you in a speculative mode, really looking for your full feedback. My main concern here is about how a global pandemic has channeled our attention towards the conjunctions of bodies and spaces, their place in the political, and crucially for my arguments, the way they reveal the forms of the social. Without doubt, given the nature of the pandemic, the biopolitical paradigm following Foucault largely has been at the forefront of theory that seeks to make sense of the current moment. This is a paradigm where knowledge of the human species meets governance structures, where governable populations are produced by this kind of anatomical knowledge, and where the biologically identified body becomes the site for governmental power. Although I position my arguments within this paradigm, I do not wish to offer any social theoretical insights into the pandemic. I would think it's a little too soon for that. I would rather use what has been developing as a biopolitical discourse around our pandemic experiences so far to revisit some core questions in two vectors. First, how in the context of the pandemic, the social relates to the political. And second, how does the current local find form in a seemingly planetary pandemic? The concerns that emerge are therefore the triangulation between the social, the political, and the biological. I will present my discussion as a couple of observations and offer a few responses to the queries prompted by those observations. My first observation is this: barring some outliers, the biomedical reaction to the pandemic has followed a singular globally converging governmentality, which is social distancing. Succinctly put, the assumption is about a singular virus creating a homogeneous population of human bodies that are globally equal in biomedical terms. Social distancing is a biosocial strategy premised on a viral presence that allegedly equalizes all. Of course, there are some speculations about how the virus might not affect all human life strains equally, and we already know that it has different pathological effects on different biological profiles like age, gender, comorbidities, etc. These will determine how social distancing will expect to produce spaces between the old versus the young, the medically vulnerable versus those with stronger immune systems, the asymptomatic versus the symptomatic. Notwithstanding, all of these categories will likely adhere to the universal biomedical sense of human life, and consequently, the wall we will want to build is between us humans and the virus. It is likely that for the first time in human history, because of the conditions of mobility and density that the contemporary allows, one could imagine biomedical humanity unified under the threat of a single virus. We cannot thus deny the situation that a single virus produces a biopolitical population that covers all of life, all of who are under one single governmental strategy, social distancing. That in itself has a destabilizing effect on the conventional biopolitical notion that differing anatomical, biomedical, or biosocial profiling will construct multiple populations which will be accompanied by differing strategically targeted biopower and governmental action. To recapitulate then, the first observation is the unprecedented recognition of a universal or a global biomedical/biosocial population and a universal governmental strategy, social distancing. My second observation follows from the above that there is a profound displacement of meaning in the phrase social distancing. This universal governmental strategy that addresses human life, species life as such, is in effect a technique of physical distancing and not social distancing at all. This slippage of terminology, simple as it might sound, and banal, leads to the larger questions of the social body and political body and their geometrics and geopolitics of space. For all practical purposes, the jurisdiction that this terminology obscures is that, in effect, it is meant entirely to regulate and monitor spaces between physical bodies. This important displacement needs to be underlined at this point because this is where the negotiations become stark. Between the universal biological on one hand and the notions of the social and the political on the other, this is also the place where universal protest politics on one hand find form in the local context on the other. I think there'll be some resonance between the earlier, the wonderful lecture we heard just before mine. There might be some resonance there, which I think could be quite interesting. So with these observations in mind, I start with my first, can you see the slides changing? For some reason, I'm not being able to see. Can you see them?
Yes, now we can see.
Okay, okay. With these observations in mind, I start with my first speculative response. I will suggest that the social will produce and differentiate populations in ways more potent than human anatomical knowledge can. My second speculation is that following from these socially differentiated populations, we will need to readjust our lens on governmental power and statecraft. So in the early days of the pandemic, in April 2020, I had written about how biopolitical concepts will need crucial recalibration. I had at the time suggested that the social need be paid a little more attention than it has been in conventional biopolitical work, posing that as an analytics of an interim, one that is between the world as we knew it before the onset of the pandemic and the world we may be moving towards. I proposed a focus on the potential conduits of governmental power that is created in and by the social. The more urgent question I felt at the time was about how governmental power will affect the reconstitution of the social and the political, and how these two vectors will itself generate the power to produce populations. Rewriting some of this today, I will continue to say that social power in the shape of regulating risk, fear, and aversion will emanate from and also be directed towards racially and socially ascribed identity, from and towards temples, churches, mosques, and their congregations. Class, race, and caste profession and association, gender and age, to cite some generic illustrations, will be the sites where power will be exercised, mimicking a governmentality that will be social rather than biological in its genesis. The virus of this pandemic or any future pandemics as a parasitic microorganism will adjust and mutate as time goes along, and it might differentiate human bodies and life into biochemically differentiated populations. Until then, the differentiating power of the virus is at the level of the social and political rather than the biological. The common human biological body will be classified not by anatomical physiological classification, but by a priori social parameters. It might seem that there is nothing new in this. A human collective unified by a virus, but already always fragmented socially and politically, will display much of the same fissures, vulnerabilities, and divisions we have always known. For instance, the fact that precarious labor will be at the highest risk was profoundly on display with the mass exodus of thousands of people leaving cities to go home in the early days of the lockdown in India, a visual I think most of us in India and perhaps in the international press as well will not forget easily. While it is true that any crisis will show up existing vulnerabilities more sharply, there are some notions that seem to be playing out which call for renewed focus. Let me illustrate by summoning up one political motive that has animated some discussions recently. Those following the political philosopher Giorgio Agamben have been intrigued and have also been critical of what he has been preoccupied by: the question of the crowd, the political potency of the crowd, and the passive paralysis that social distancing imposes on this political potential. I use Agamben's words at some length because it does help me focus on what I'm trying to say. This is really from a short piece that he published on the 7th of April. I think it's called, the blog site is called Autonomies. And he says, although there are as always fools who suggest that such a situation can certainly be considered positive, and that the new digital technologies have long allowed people to happily communicate from a distance, I do not believe that a community founded on social distancing is humanly and politically viable. Then he goes on to say, a first consideration concerns the truly singular nature of the phenomenon that the measures of social distancing have produced. In Elias Canetti's masterpiece, Crowds and Power, he defines the crowd or the mass on which power is based as the inversion of the fear of being touched. While men usually fear being touched by the stranger, and all the distances that men establish around themselves arise from this fear, the mass is the only situation in which this fear is overturned to become its opposite. It is only in a crowd that man can become free of this fear of being touched. These are Canetti's words. That is the only situation in which fear changes into its opposite. As soon as a man has surrendered himself to the crowd, he ceases to fear its touch. This reversal of fear of being touched belongs to the nature of crowds. Now, these few sentences where Agamben interlocutes Canetti, we are led to a tableau that is constituted by bodies crowded in space and the political charge that emerges in that visceral proximal crowd. Agamben rightly summons Canetti's masterpiece, as many have done in the reading of Crowds. He's particularly focused on Canetti's idea that fear rules the inability to touch, to be skin to skin, body to body. And it is the charge in the kinesthetics of the crowd that dispels that fear and sustains the political movement. We know what this means in the realm of public protests. Agamben implies that social distancing threatens that visceral public to obliteration. No proximity, no assembly, thus no political life. Even outside of Agamben, many have commented on how the lockdown measures in India or elsewhere have implied severe curtailment of civil liberties. They mention these as the ways and routes through which state structures gain more and more control. However, and this is where we move towards the local and the particular, the located histories and the emplaced times, it is quite evident that in spite of the pandemic, all across the globe, crowds did materialize as protests, as political gatherings, etc., and they continue to do so for a variety of public political reasons. The technique of physical distancing clearly did not diminish the surge of crowds or their political potential, as Ackerman lamented. This is where I will pose the question, in the conditions we know today, if crowds are the location of political potential, what happens when a life-threatening virus is thrown into the mix? What does it tell us about politics? This takes me back to the difference between social and political distancing and how that difference is leading to a misplacement of power and to a confusion in political potential. The governmental strategy of physical distancing works exactly with Kanete's idea of fear of touching. Governmental power seeks to regulate and monitor the physical space between bodies in a pandemic. By invoking a unified population produced by the COVID-19 virus, all equally at risk, this technique endorses the notion that the risk is individual and individual alone, and immunity is possible only when physical bodies stay apart from one another. Governmentality translates this to the only technique it knows, that of law and order regulations with which to monitor that space between individuals. This then is the universal aspect of this phenomenon we are in. However, the worldwide proliferation of political crowds in the time of the pandemic, I'm persuaded, is indeed about displaying acutely, first, the located social and the political contingency of the social. This weakens our notion that the common biopolitical strategy of social distancing will subvert our social and political life. Rather, this kind of formation of crowds in political protest, where biological fear should have kept people apart, was in effect an expression of the priority of the social. To emphasize again, these crowds and their assemblies bring to clear focus the geographical and historical particulars, the geopolitical and the local that come alive in the face of a universally homogenizing virus. I offer this first, and this is a small point, as a critique of conventional biopolitics, perhaps from an Indian social, where I find that the notion of the social is not really given the centrality it deserves. Allow me to elaborate on this further. The immunization of the physical body is not the same as the immunization of the social collective. The physiology of the first, that is the individual body, is not the same as the sociology of the second, that is the social collective. Biology perhaps embodies and individuates, but the social produces groupings and collectivizes. While the biological body can immunize against another biological body, the collective body immunizes against other social collective bodies. Let me anchor this with reference to someone called Frederick Negrath, when he says, and this is in his translation of Esposito's Categories of the Political. And he says, immunization does not only affect individuals, it also concerns collectives. Historically, this has been the case since the birth of nationalism. And today we see how so-called national identities, even though they have had their day and are no longer capable of imagining themselves, replace the impossible imaginary institution of society by the reality of walls, camps, of fortress Europe, of control and spatio-temporal surveillance. I don't have to tell you which names to substitute or keep with Europe. But should society stop then to immunize against themselves through a sort of immunization of community that would mark the biopolitical destiny of modernity? Let me try and explain this with examples from certain protesting crowds during the pandemic. We are aware of the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer in the United States, followed by the Capitol incident. Both instances were very much in severe pandemic conditions. We are also aware in India about the farmers' protests as they are going on. I'm not going to go into the protests themselves and the issues they're concerned with. I'm concerned with understanding how the body crowd conjunction plays out in the presence of a contagious, life-paralyzing virus. And the way this conjunction gives us an articulation of how the biological, in effect, interacts with the social and the political. The immunizing instinct of the individual body appears to have an impact on how individuals conduct themselves in physical space. But in these crowds, the fear of contact seems to disappear. I will suggest that when the social makes an appearance, the immunizing instinct of the individual body is willing and persuaded, or obliged and coerced, to be subservient to the social collective, the social common. But here, another kind of immunizing takes place. It is not against other bodies, but other social collectives. In the United States, the Black Lives Matter protest is about racialized social collectives attempting to immunize themselves against brutal prejudice. Eventually, this is a protest against a nation colored by white ideology, against a collective defined by that ideology. In India, the farmers are allegedly poised against a developing nation. But there is a fine-tuned difference between the Black Lives Matter protest and those of the farmers. The former is based on a socially ascribed identity race, and the latter on an occupational collective. It is interesting to see how the farmer protest slides in and out of identity significations, where farmers shift shape, as it were, between their role as a collective congealing around an occupational identity or social, cultural, and religious regional identities. These constructions dictate what kind of immunizing practices will be deployed and who will immunize and who will be immunized against. The common biological threat or the common biological body seems to disappear from public space. When these social identities collectivize and immunize against such other identities, they bring in the force of a crowd and dispel the fear of the body, the physical touch. The governmental technique to build physical distances between bodies remain important, and in practice, there is nothing with which to discipline the individual body against other individual bodies. To return to Agamben's use of connectives touching crowds, the contagion, if I may call it that, is a social contagion, not a physical one. The power of the political or the potential of political collective emerges from that of a social haptic, a social touch, not that of a physical touch. It is in this juncture that I bring my speculative analytics to a kind of a conclusion with a proposition to examine both the assertive and the vulnerable side of the social and the way it lends itself to political control. And it is in the presence of extreme biological vulnerability, like in this and possible future pandemic times, that the social presents itself more acutely, either as a lack or as an excess. Two important nuances I'd like to propose here. First, at the heart of governmentality lies the desire to govern the social, not the individual, and that perhaps has been the biopolitical destiny that Nadar talks about. In my small example of crowds and political protest, I have gestured towards the conduct of socially inscribed beings, those with ascriptive identities who are then classified into political, juridical, economic, and perhaps biological beings. Second, and this is why governmentality is at pains to identify populations socially and not physically. Socially ascribed populations attempt to immunize against other populations or collectivize in the first place to protect themselves against others. Governmentality is able to co-opt that power into political strategy, such that the power to immunize is in fact the power to declare the borders and boundaries between collectives. The territorial nation and the many variations of collectives within, that perhaps is the key to understanding a very potent aspect of governmental power. If the farmers are from a social community, then they can and must be immunized against. However, if they are not, how do you immunize against an occupation, especially one that provides the very lifeline of biological existence? This leads me to my final point, which is what I'm trying to underline and I'm calling a lack in the social, and what is it that I can call an excess of the social. The lack in the social in my proposition is that of the common, sometimes called humanity, and its excess is its ability to be divisive. A statement, ironically enough, made by Agamben in a set of essays written after the Tiananmen Square incidents implies a remarkable observation. In a book called The Coming Community, he reads the Tiananmen incident as an event where democracy and freedom as the stated objectives are much too generic and broadly defined to get at the heart of what that event was about. Rather, for him, the event meant the potential of coming politics. Let me share his words. The novelty of the coming politics is that it will no longer be a struggle for the conquest or control of the state, but a struggle between the state and the non-state, in brackets humanity. This has nothing to do with the simple affirmation of the social in opposition to the state that has often found expression in the protest movements of recent years. And this is where he says something interesting. In the final instance, the state can recognize any claim for identity, even that of a state identity within the state. What the state cannot tolerate in any way, however, is that the singularities form a community without affirming an identity, that humans co-belong without any representable condition of belonging. And this is a statement that I find very interesting when he says that a being radically devoid of any representable identity would be absolutely irrelevant to the state. He, of course, anchors this with a concept which I can discuss later. This is when he talks about whatever a certain singularity, but I'm keeping that fairly complex philosophical notion outside of this. But I think the statement itself is rather startling. And the startling meaning that pushes through is this. This is the idea that bears allegiance to the possibility of a non-identity, where singularity matters more than commonality of the socially ascribed essences. His focus is in underlying the absence of any determinate politics in that event, and I would add perhaps the absence of any determinate identity politics as such. The last statement that he makes, being radically devoid of any representable identity would be absolutely irrelevant to the state, is especially pertinent to me. It seems to me that this irrelevance of those who do not have any socially potent identity to offer has been particularly stark in this pandemic. By this, I mean the purely physical crowd, like that of the hordes of migrant workers, like that of our already assembled crowds in dense slums. In many ways, this is the vulnerability of any, each, and all bodies that cannot command the freedom of space, whether in the global north or in the global south. Their vulnerability is also their inability to claim physical space. For example, the claim over a home is a claim over space, and the powerlessness to command space is also an inability to command immunity from other contagious bodies. I would think that their vulnerability is their incapacity to immunize themselves as purely biomedical, physical entities, and this is where governmentality fails them and finds them irrelevant. They may have been relevant to state power if they had summoned a social identity to be politically potent. The political response of the state is indeed towards those who offer themselves as social collectives. This is the social excess that the state co-opts in order to summon immunizing mechanisms of power. The problem that remains then is this: what kind of social collective is on the ascendance in our contemporary? What are those identities that break the flesh and blood common and build immunizing boundaries around them? How do these boundaries, in effect, weaken the political? With an earlier Agamben, then, I'd like to consider the coming politics of pure bodies in public political space. I'd like to leave you with a resonant thought here. This is a fairly well-known statement by Ambedkar. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we'll have equality. In social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we shall be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. This, I expect, is the lack in our social. I'll stop there. Thank you. I think I did good time.
Yes, thank you very much. You went a little bit over the time limit, but that was entirely justified, I would like to say. And I did not want to interrupt you or to send out any warnings. And it was not too bad. It's 43 now. That is perfectly fine. Thanks for a really wonderful, in many ways, I think, mind-blowing presentation.
Thank you so much.
To me, seemed to have been very much what I would like to call a dialectical exercise, almost a series of dialectical exercises. And it leaves me asking about, a general label to be affixed to the present situation, either with a view to India or any other, nation state, or with a view to the global condition. If I'm reading you correctly, you have suggested that the virus has generated a situation where immense problems and also immense potentialities are in place. So
yes.
This might be turned around. This might be used in a proper way. This might turn out to have been beneficial after all, but it only might, of course. So it is a critical situation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I think it has been so mind-blowing that not too many questions have come up yet in the chat. But may I ask one and invite you to return perhaps to the inaugural lecture by Professor Appadurai, where he talked about the fatigue and the haptic, and somehow counterintuitively seemed to develop the relationship between the two on the basis of reading the haptic, developing his concept of the haptic from the realities and the ideologies of the Indian caste system. If you would bring in this idea of this set of ideas of the haptic and the fatigue, and could you link it to your lecture and your presentation?
Yeah, I could try. I think one of the things I could do is perhaps connected to what you were suggesting in the beginning when you were commenting on the way in which I probably sort of suggested that there is, in fact, something good that might come out of the virus after all. I think it's a larger, and you're right, but this has been too much of a cryptic presentation of a fairly complex, I guess, interaction of ideas. But what I do want to think about is this. It's that what happens with the biopolitical understanding of things is that the body, the governable body, is really seen as a kind of a victim site in many ways. It's the object on which power is located. Somewhere along the line, I think I've been trying to work through two sorts of things. One is to say that is it possible to think in a situation where we have nothing left in common, what is it that we can think about as having as common? And that's where I pose in the idea of the flesh and blood body, and suggesting that perhaps there may be a way out, and there are many ways in which I think from the recent, it's something to do with also the acoustics. I want to think about that as well, the connection of sound, the connection of what was talked about in the utopian sense of solidarity last night. I think all of these things I'm trying to pull together and suggest that is there a possibility of imagining a humanity or a humanism which can be potent at a time when identity politics is so powerful. So I think that's part of the problem of, it's part of my problem in trying to pose this in this sort of a way, is that at the end of the day, if we return to the body in many ways, I am finding that perhaps a way out of the place and time where identity politics is just leading to collectives more at war with each other, rather than finding ways to be, to construct any kind of solidarity at all. So that seems to be quite a kind of thing that I'm trying to get at. The second thing, trying to put it together with Professor Appadurai's, I'm not sure I quite understood what he was suggesting. I think I'll have to read it to get a good sense of what he was saying. I think, please correct me, and there are many of you here who were there. Somewhere along the line, I felt he was suggesting that it's this tip of the hierarchical tower, the Brahminical tip, is really the most untouchable of them all in a certain sense, because that's the world, that's the social universe that has been created around them. Yeah, I mean, that that kind of the sense of touching, the sense of the haptic and the phatic there, and the kind of social divisions that are there out there, I'm not being able to understand how to put that into the kind of political potential that I'm talking about, because that has always been the case in a certain sense. We can look at it from any perspective. I mean, the fact of Brahmanical social boundary making is something that has always been there. I mean, there is nothing particularly new that we can think through that. And in a certain sense, does that necessarily also, I'm not particularly sure if that could be the only lens we can understand the movement of the haptic and the phatic. And this is why I'm trying to understand. That's why I keep saying that I'm not sure I understood his lecture quite completely, because I have to understand what his problematic is, because I'm not quite getting it from there. So I do not want to really pose a connection at this point. So, but sure, I mean, yeah, I think I'll need to think through the connections there.
Meanwhile, a couple of questions have come up in the chat. May I perhaps play the ball to Stephen George to read out some of these questions to us,
Shall I take
Professor
over?
Arif?
Yes, the first question, in fact, is from Stephen himself. Yes, so the question is this. The term social distancing is what I think the government policies wanted to apply. On the eve of New Year, various states drew out a restriction on movement. The policy was not applied uniformly. So my question is, does the state really want physical distance when they have opened up most of the things? They actually want more of social distancing in bracket. May I also read the other two questions and then, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Yes, may I read the other two questions and perhaps you can respond?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes.
The next question is from Professor Baduri. He is asking, I was wondering about the geometry bit in your title. Could you elaborate? And the third question is from me, and this is, thank you for your enlightening lecture, Professor Arif. I was thinking about how one can think about the positionality of the refugee body, stateless in many senses, or in liminal positioning within the larger frame of your talk. Kindly share your thoughts on the same. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you again for all the engagement. The first one, the question of term, the social distancing, I'm not really placing it in the linear way in which government policy has unfolded. So yeah, there was this kind of policy, the idea that, you know, there will be times during festivals, etc., New Year's, where there'll be some kind of social groupings, and therefore we want social distancing. That's not quite the place I'm going at. And that's why, of course, things are going to open up now, given that we have a sense of, I'm really working with the conceptual configurations that are working out here, is that what you're calling social distancing is really about keeping bodies apart as individuals. Right. So even if you want to have a collective of parties, etc., then that little symbol of distancing, namely the mask, is very much still a part of the policy, right? And apparently we are supposed to live with that for a very long time, except on screen time. So I think it becomes very important to understand how, I mean, in that sense, Professor Ackerman, I mean, that's where the phatic and the haptic would make some sense to me. I'm not very sure how to apply it to social collectives of the, because, you know, in India, talking about social distancing, as a lot of people have pointed out, is another kind of question which leads us to untouchability in very different ways. So that's not the kind of thing. So what I want to say in response is that I'm not going with the linear idea of governmental policy, but working with larger kind of configurations. Yes, the geometry bit is something, yeah, I should have probably written more about it. What I really meant, and I think I'm glad you're bringing my focus back into it, is that one of the things that I was trying to, and I just didn't have the time to bring it into today's lecture, is really trying to think about what has been the trajectories of movement, the vectors of movement, when you start looking at, when we're looking at it from the isolation of the human body. And how does the vector of movement lead you towards other social collectives, especially when something like a virus is between you? So what is the momentum? How do you sort of? So in that sense, I thought I'm going to be able to do this later. I hope when I get into this paper, is that, and this is again coming back to Professor Ackermann's point, is that if I want to put my utopian hope into this solidarity of human bodies alone, then it will be very interesting to see what are the vectors of momentum through which this kind of these geometric solidarities can even take place. So is it possible for me to say that, there is a way in which the victimhood of, if you like, or the oppression is not about the skin per se, but what lies underneath in that sense, and suffering, all kinds of whatever we talk about, and in the realm of governmental power or governmental irrelevance, that's what I want to think about in that geometric kind of sense, which kind of brings me to Anne Susan, right? That's you, I think, yeah. It brings me to your question, is that, see, I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens when I'm trying to collapse too many ideas into a small presentation. I think this is precisely the point where the terrains of consciousness part of your title really plays into your question, because what's happening here is precisely what I'm saying, is that we've talked about state power, governmental power in many ways, and I'm not necessarily concerned to the extent that I follow Foucault. I'm not really concerned about the source of that power. I'm interested in knowing how boundaries and borders can be multiplied when you take on that kind of disciplining of bodies in space. So the refugee problem is entirely that. It's about manufacturing borders where there weren't any, or even if they are there, then how do you then understand this notion of who's a refugee, who is not? I mean, it's obviously never been a very clear question way back from the times of Hannah Arendt, and the questions of nationalism, etc. So I think I'm hoping I'm getting you. I'm getting some answer to you. I mean, I do have to apologize. It's a lot of ideas that I've thrown into one, but
thanks a lot. Lots of really productive ideas, and I feel it would be wonderful if we would have the time to play this back to Brandon LaBelle, because we've seen, as you have already indicated, two very, very different approaches to a related problem, and we are on the verge of, kind of making the topic of our conference politically relevant to the very present, right? This is where we are. What we could do now, but we have to stop. Right. I'm afraid we're already over time a little bit. Thanks a load to both of us and to our audience, and the many, many very interesting questions. We have only addressed some of those, but maybe you can get back to them in the chat. So this is where I would like to stop and hand back to the conference team, so to speak.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of the conference committee, may I extend my heartiest and sincere thanks to Professor Brandon LaBelle, Professor Yasmeen Arif, and our dear chair, Professor Zeno Ackermann. This was a very, very engaging session. Thank you so much. And now we move on to the next session, which is session 5, paper presentations. It should start very soon in 2 minutes. So thank you. Over to you, Shraddha and Zara. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so we do have just about a minute or so before we start. So and all the paper presenters obviously are here, and we have the chair also. Brinda is here. So good to see you, Brinda. Absolutely welcome to the conference. And so maybe we can just about start in a minute. That's what we can do.
Sure.
So Zara and Shraddha, you guys can tell us, we are your slaves whenever we should start. Huh?
We can start. Let's start at 4:30.
Right.
Yes, whoever wants to check their mics or their PPTs, feel free to do so right now.
We're
Hello,
still live.
Simran.
We're still live, Zara.
Do you want me to stop it?
No, it's fine. Since we're just seamlessly moving, I mean, I think it's fine.
Sorry for going over time. I really could not, didn't have the heart to stop it, so to speak.
No. One didn't want, in fact, one wanted that Yasmeen should just carry on, and one didn't want the session to actually come to a close.
Yeah, I felt it